A sailor enters through the heavy wooden doors of a brothel, hidden in the shadows of a bustling ancient port. He expects the usual laughter, the songs of women trying to lure him inside. But here, the corridors are silent. Not a whisper, not a murmur, not even the sound of weeping. Dozens of women sit waiting in dimly lit rooms, eyes hollow, lips trembling, but no words leave their mouths. For some, tongues have been cut. For others, scars burn where voices once lived. In this house, silence is the law, and breaking it means mutilation. The story begins in an unnamed quarter of an ancient Mediterranean port city, where the brothel of silence first appeared. It was a place that operated outside the ordinary markets of lust. Its notoriety spread not through advertisements or invitations, but through hushed murmurs among merchants, sailors, and soldiers. They called it the House of Voiceless Women. From the outside, the structure looked like any other lodging house: stone walls, iron doors, and the faint sound of footsteps echoing down narrow corridors. Yet inside, the rules were unlike any other brothel of the era. Here, prostitutes were forbidden to speak. Their silence was not born of choice or shame, but of punishment. Many had their tongues mutilated, their lips burned, or their throats scarred to ensure that words would never again pass through them. The brothel master understood the psychology of silence. For clients, voiceless women became vessels for fantasy, a blank canvas upon which desire could be projected without contradiction. There would be no pleas for mercy, no complaints, no bargaining. Only obedience, delivered in silence, enforced by the weight of terror. What made this house different from the countless other brothels of the ancient world was not only its brutality, but its reputation. Men traveled great distances, driven by curiosity, cruelty, or the perverse attraction of novelty. They paid dearly for entry, knowing they would be served by women who could not utter a sound. For some, this silence was erotic. For others, it was power, the ability to dominate without resistance. But for the women inside, silence was a cage. They were robbed not only of their speech, but of their very humanity. Their names were replaced by numbers or crude nicknames, spoken only by guards or owners. Some had once been wives, daughters, or even priestesses, captured during war and sold into this hell. Others were born into slavery, sold by desperate families to satisfy the appetites of the cruel and wealthy. Every step within the brothel was measured by fear. In the dimly lit corridors, guards patrolled, ensuring compliance. Whispers were forbidden. Even the sound of weeping could draw punishment. To survive, the women learned to mask their emotions, eyes cast downward, gestures controlled, their silence becoming their only shield. And yet, within that silence, their suffering screamed louder than words. The echo of what they endured would survive centuries, buried in fragments of history, whispered through rumors and recorded in hushed accounts by travelers who dared to reveal what they had seen. This was not just a brothel. It was a prison of flesh and silence, where human suffering was transformed into entertainment, and where the cruelty of men was made eternal by the suffering of women who could never speak their truth. The women who filled the silent house of flesh did not arrive by choice. Their stories began long before the stone walls swallowed them in the chaos of war, poverty, and betrayal. Some were dragged from burning villages during military campaigns. Others were daughters of debtors, sold to satisfy a creditor's demand. A few were even betrayed by their own families, offered as commodities when survival meant sacrificing blood for coin. Picture the journey of one such woman. She is bound in chains, wrists rubbed raw from iron shackles. She marches in a line of captives along a dusty road, guarded by soldiers who mock their tears. Some women stumble, too weak to continue, and are whipped until they rise again. That night they are herded into barns, fed scraps, and treated like livestock. Their destination is the slave market, where merchants will measure their bodies, haggle over prices, and determine their fate with a casual exchange of silver. From the market, the path grows darker. Most women were purchased for domestic service or as concubines. But those selected for the silent house faced something far worse. The brothel master chose carefully, preferring the young, the attractive, and the vulnerable women whose silence would fetch the highest price. Once purchased, they were marched under guard through the city's narrow streets to the brothel's heavy iron gates. For them, it was the last doorway they would ever cross as free individuals. The initiation stripped away every trace of their former lives. Names were erased, replaced by crude labels: the blonde, the tall one, or simply numbers. Clothing was confiscated, replaced with garments meant to display their bodies while erasing their dignity. Then came the warning: no words, no whispers, no sound beyond what the clients demanded. Guards demonstrated punishments in advance, showing mutilated women as examples of what silence required. The message was unmistakable obedience or disfigurement. Some women tried to resist, clinging to the idea that silence could be broken, that cries for help might reach sympathetic ears. But rebellion had no place here. Attempts to escape were crushed mercilessly. Women caught running were paraded before the others, beaten, and then branded. Those who spoke too often or too loudly were punished with the removal of their tongues. Their screams turned into gurgles that ended in silence. Over time, obedience was carved into their bodies as much as their minds. The guards controlled every aspect of their existence: when they ate, when they slept, when they were led to waiting clients. Even their posture was monitored, ensuring that heads remained bowed in submission. Silence was not just enforced, it became ritual, shaping them into shadows of their former selves. For the clients who arrived, this system of obedience was part of the spectacle. They knew the women would not speak, could not speak, and that knowledge heightened the sense of control. The brothel master sold not just sex, but domination, offering men the fantasy of absolute power over women who had been robbed of every human right, down to the sound of their voices. The tragedy of these women's lives lay not only in their captivity, but in the cruel transformation they were forced to endure. They entered as daughters, wives, or villagers. They became commodities of silence, chained by fear, their obedience extracted not through loyalty, but through terror. This was the true machinery of the silent house, a system designed to erase identity, enforce silence, and reduce human beings into obedient vessels of suffering. And in this obedience, enforced by chains both visible and invisible, the brothel found its most profitable resource: women too broken to resist, yet too alive to escape their nightmare. In the silent house of flesh, the greatest crime was speech. A single whisper, a muffled sob mistaken for words, or even the sound of pleading could unleash the most dreaded punishment of all: the mutilation of the tongue. The terror began the moment women entered the brothel. Guards reminded them daily that silence was survival. In dark corners of the house, mutilated women stood as living warnings. Their mouths bore scars where tongues had once been. Some had burned lips, others teeth broken with iron rods, all proof that the brothel's rules were enforced without mercy. These women did not need to speak, their mutilated silence spoke louder than any words. Punishment was both ritual and spectacle. When a woman was accused of breaking the silence, she was dragged before the others. Her hands were bound tightly, her head forced back. A heated blade or iron tool would be pressed into her mouth. The room would fill with the smell of scorched flesh as the instrument sliced or burned, severing the organ that gave her voice. Some died from infection or blood loss. Those who survived became permanent examples of obedience. Clients often paid extra to be with these silenced women. Their mutilation became a grotesque selling point, proof that they had been disciplined. The brothel master twisted cruelty into profit, claiming that voiceless prostitutes offered an unbroken purity of silence. For men seeking dominance, the absence of speech was intoxicating. They could project any fantasy, commit any act, without the interruption of cries, pleas, or resistance. Silence was sold as luxury, but in truth, it was the deepest form of human degradation. Not all punishments involved the cutting of tongues. Some women had their lips burned with hot irons, leaving scars that prevented clear speech. Others were forced to bite down on wooden rods while their teeth were shattered, ensuring their mouths would never form words again. These acts were not random, they were deliberate tools of terror, designed to remind every woman in the house of the consequences of disobedience. The psychological effect was devastating. Women lived in constant fear of making sounds. Even crying became dangerous. Many forced themselves into emotional numbness, suppressing sobs so they would not risk punishment. The silence grew so heavy that even the shuffle of bare feet on the stone floors felt deafening. The brothel became a graveyard of voices, its walls echoing not with laughter or moans, but with the absence of sound. Survivors who later escaped described how this punishment broke the human spirit. Without the ability to speak, many lost their sense of self. A name, a voice, a word, all were essential parts of identity. Stripped of these, the women became shadows of themselves. Some stopped trying to communicate altogether, their eyes glazed with resignation. Others developed subtle, secret ways to resist passing messages through gestures, touches, or looks. But these small rebellions carried enormous risk. What made the punishment even more horrifying was its permanence. Scars healed, chains could be broken, but the loss of a tongue or the mutilation of a mouth could never be undone. The women knew that even if they escaped, they would remain voiceless for life. Their silence would follow them beyond the brothel walls, a living reminder of the cruelty inflicted upon them. The silent house thrived because of this system of mutilation. Silence was enforced not simply through fear, but through irreversible violence. Each punishment fed the cycle: obedience through terror, profit through suffering, silence as spectacle. And in this grim economy, women's voices were not just ignored, they were destroyed, leaving behind only the soundless echo of human cruelty. Every brothel had rules, but the silent house of flesh enforced them through ceremonies designed to strip away humanity itself. These were not simple warnings or casual threats. They were rituals of dehumanization, acts meant to remind every woman that she was no longer a person, but property. The process began the moment a new captive arrived. Her clothes were torn away, not only to humiliate her, but to erase the last symbol of her former life. She was washed in cold water while guards mocked her trembling body. Then came the inspection. Merchants, guards, and the brothel master studied her as if she were livestock. Teeth were pried open, limbs stretched, scars or birthmarks noted. No word was spoken to her, not even her name. From that moment forward, she was an object. After the inspection, silence was imposed through ritual. Women were forced to kneel in a dim chamber lit only by oil lamps. Before them stood mutilated women, displayed like grim statues. The brothel master would explain the rules: no speech, no protest, no sound beyond obedience. To break this rule meant disfigurement or death. The mutilated women stood as proof, their scars glowing in the flickering light, their eyes hollow reminders of punishment survived. This ritual served two purposes. For the women, it was terror made flesh, a warning that silence was not negotiable. For the guards, it reinforced control, ensuring that obedience was never in doubt. And for the clients, who were sometimes permitted to witness parts of the initiation, it created an aura of forbidden spectacle. They knew the women they touched were broken by ritual, trained into silence, stripped of the last fragments of dignity. The rituals did not end there. Before entering their chambers each night, women were subjected to further humiliations. They were lined up in silence while guards inspected their bodies again, checking for signs of illness, pregnancy, or hidden injuries. Any who faltered, who appeared weak or unwilling, were beaten in front of the others. The pain of one became the warning to all. Some rituals were symbolic acts of erasure. A woman's hair might be cut to remove vanity. A tattoo or mark could be branded on her skin, a permanent reminder of ownership. In some accounts, women were forced to wear small chains or collars when serving clients, visible tokens of their captivity, designed to thrill men who desired control as much as flesh. Perhaps the cruelest ritual was the nightly silence test. Guards would patrol the chambers, listening closely. A cough, a sob, or even the rustle of lips moving could bring punishment. Women learned to control even their breathing, terrified that the wrong sound might betray them. Silence became ritual not just in rule, but in body and mind. These practices transformed the brothel into something darker than a place of prostitution. It became a theater of cruelty, where ritual dehumanization was the opening act before every encounter. The women were reduced to vessels, stripped of individuality, bound by silence that was both physical and psychological. Yet beneath this system of control, fragments of humanity endured. Some women resisted inwardly, refusing to let the rituals erase their sense of self. They clung to memories of families, villages, or lives stolen from them. Others formed silent bonds, comforting each other with a glance or a touch when no guards were watching. Their survival itself was an act of defiance. For the men who visited, these rituals only heightened the allure. They were not simply paying for sex. They were paying to participate in a carefully crafted illusion of power, where women existed only as silent, obedient bodies. The rituals guaranteed this illusion, turning suffering into performance, cruelty into profit. The silent house thrived because of these ceremonies. By reducing women to objects through ritualized humiliation, the brothel ensured obedience, created spectacle, and satisfied the darkest appetites of its clients. Every scar, every forced silence, every act of degradation was part of a system designed to erase humanity and sell the remains as entertainment. The silent house of flesh did not survive on secrecy alone. It thrived because of the men who sought it out. They came in shadows, men of rank and wealth, men whose appetites demanded something beyond the ordinary. These were not simply patrons of pleasure. They were participants in cruelty, willing to pay handsomely for silence, obedience, and the assurance that no word of their desires would ever escape the walls. Soldiers were among the most frequent visitors. After months of campaigns and bloodshed, they sought not companionship but domination. For men who had killed and seen comrades die, the mute bodies of the brothel offered an extension of the battlefield, an arena where they could vent rage without consequence. Silence ensured that no plea for mercy would remind them of their victims. The women became substitutes for conquered foes, their bodies repositories for violence disguised as lust. But soldiers were not alone. Politicians and administrators also crept into the silent house. For them, silence was protection. They were men who lived in fear of scandal, where a whisper could destroy reputations and unravel power. In the ordinary brothels of Rome, Greece, or Egypt, prostitutes sometimes spoke, sometimes too much. But here, silence was guaranteed. No matter what was done, no matter how degrading the act, there would be no witnesses, no informants. These men believed they were buying not only flesh but secrecy. Then there were the wealthy elites, aristocrats, merchants, even priests. For them, the allure was stranger still. It was not merely lust nor fear of exposure, but fascination with silence itself. They desired women who could not cry out, who could not refuse, who could not even speak their own names. It was a fantasy of control so complete that it blurred the line between sex and slavery, between indulgence and cruelty. Some whispered that these men paid extra to witness the initiation rituals, drawn not only to the act of pleasure but to the spectacle of women being broken into silence. For certain clients, silence offered freedom from shame. In a world where sexual practices could be judged harshly, they could indulge in acts that elsewhere would bring ridicule. Whether it was cruelty, perversion, or forbidden desires, The mute women were both the victims and the shield. Their silence swallowed not only their pain, but also their clients' reputations. The brothel master understood this hunger and exploited it. He kept detailed records not of names, but of preferences. Some men demanded young women, others women with certain features, others women already mutilated as proof of punishment. The silent house was tailored to the darkest needs, ensuring that every appetite could be satisfied under the cloak of secrecy. Yet the most unsettling part of this clientele was not their actions, but their indifference. To them, the women were not people but instruments. They spoke of their visits as if discussing wine or theater, reducing human suffering to entertainment. Silence allowed them to pretend that pain was absent, that the women's stillness was compliance rather than coercion. Historians suggest that this clientele reveals the brothel's true function. It was less a house of pleasure and more a mirror of power where soldiers, officials, and elites acted out their authority upon bodies stripped of voice. The silent house did not simply sell sex. It sold the illusion of absolute control. And still, the demand never faltered. As long as men sought secrecy, silence, and domination, the brothel thrived. Its walls absorbed the sins of the powerful, while the women bore the scars. In every transaction, silence was both the product and the prison. In the silent house of flesh, silence was not simply expected. It was enforced with methods so brutal that even whispers of them chilled those who heard. The brothel's survival depended on fear, and fear was cultivated through punishment, mutilation, and humiliation. The first method was mutilation. A woman caught speaking, even in a whisper, faced the knife. Some had their tongues cut to ensure obedience, a mutilation that left them permanently voiceless. Others suffered lesser but still horrifying penalties: lips burned with hot iron, teeth smashed, or ears sliced as visible warnings. Each scar became both a punishment and a message to others. Obedience was survival. Beatings were routine. Guards wielded rods or whips, striking without hesitation. Punishment was often carried out publicly, forcing other women to witness. One woman's pain became a lesson to all, binding silence not only by fear of personal suffering, but by shared terror. This spectacle reinforced control more effectively than threats alone. Isolation was another weapon. Women who resisted or wept too loudly were locked in dark cells without food or water. In that darkness, silence became unbearable, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. Some emerged broken, others defiant, but all understood the cost of disobedience. Psychological control was just as cruel. Guards spread rumors of women who had been executed for defiance, their bodies discarded in alleys as warnings. Whether true or exaggerated, such stories deepened the atmosphere of dread. Fear became a tool sharper than any blade. Clients were sometimes involved in punishments. Men with appetites for cruelty paid extra to watch or even participate in disciplining women. This turned suffering into spectacle, binding punishment with profit. The brothel master encouraged it, knowing fear entertained as much as flesh. There were also collective punishments. If one woman disobeyed, others suffered with her. This forced captives to police one another, creating distrust and eliminating unity. Whispered solidarity could not survive when the mistake of one brought pain to many. Yet the most devastating punishment was silence itself. After beatings or mutilation, women were forced back to work without pause, their pain hidden behind mute compliance. They could not cry, plead, or name their suffering. Their wounds became invisible within the enforced quiet, turning punishment into a permanent state rather than a passing act. Historians argue that these methods reveal more than cruelty. They expose a system built on absolute control. The silent house was not only about selling bodies, it was about erasing resistance. By ensuring fear ruled every corner, the brothel master guaranteed profit, obedience, and the continuation of silence that defined the house. For the women, survival meant adapting. Some withdrew into themselves, numbing their minds against pain. Others relied on fleeting gestures of comfort, a shared glance, a hidden touch to resist complete erasure. Yet no act of kindness could undo the weight of punishments that loomed daily. Punishment was not the exception in the silent house, it was the foundation. And as long as silence was enforced through terror, the brothel stood as one of the darkest institutions of its age, a place where obedience was carved into flesh, and silence was bought with blood. Daily existence in the silent house of flesh was not life as we know it. It was survival within a system designed to strip women of time, identity, and hope. Every hour was controlled, every gesture monitored, every sound forbidden. What remained was a rhythm of captivity, a routine of obedience where silence framed each passing moment. The day began before dawn. Guards roused the women with sharp knocks on doors or lashes from whips. Sleep was shallow, broken by fear of patrols listening for forbidden sounds in the night. At first light, women were taken to the communal chamber, where they were inspected for cleanliness and health. Any sign of weakness, illness, trembling, even exhaustion could trigger punishment or removal. Food was sparse: stale bread, watered wine, or thin porridge. Meals were taken in silence, always under the gaze of guards. Women learned to chew slowly, hiding hunger behind blank expressions. Conversation, once a comfort in other places, here became a memory. They ate like shadows, their thoughts locked inside their own skulls. After meals, the women were prepared for clients. Slaves washed their bodies, applied oils, and dressed them in garments chosen by the brothel master. Some were draped in finery to please aristocrats. Others kept merely bare to satisfy soldiers who sought raw possession. Each outfit was a costume, reinforcing the illusion that these women were no longer themselves, but vessels to fulfill men's desires. The nights were the darkest. Women were led to chambers, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups. Each room bore the stench of oil, sweat, and iron. Clients arrived with demands, often cruel, always certain they would never be contradicted. Silence turned the women into objects, bodies that endured without complaint, without words. Even in agony, they could not cry out. Their muteness gave the illusion of compliance, masking pain behind enforced quiet. Between visits, women waited in holding rooms. These were long, dim spaces where they sat together but rarely dared to communicate. A glance or a touch became dangerous under the eyes of guards. Yet tiny rebellions survived an exchange of bread, a hand pressed briefly to another's arm, a silent act of solidarity that the masters tried to erase but could not completely destroy. There were moments of routine beyond the work. Some women were tasked with cleaning chambers, laundering sheets, or carrying water. Others repaired garments or tended to the fires. These duties, though exhausting, gave them brief reprieve from the humiliation of serving clients. For a few moments, they could pretend they were simply laborers, not prisoners in a house of silence. But the silence weighed heavier than chains. Women lived in constant fear of their own voices. A cough, a sob, a whispered prayer could invite the whip or knife. Over time, many learned to suppress natural impulses, training themselves to breathe lightly, to swallow grief without sound. Silence did not just bind their tongues, it reshaped their very being. And yet, despite the crushing monotony, humanity lingered. Women remembered their names, even if they could never speak them. They held memories of homes, families, and lost freedom. In the darkest nights, they clung to hope, not of escape, perhaps, but of being remembered, of not vanishing into silence forever. Daily life in the silent house was a cycle of humiliation, service, and fear. But it was also a testament to endurance. Even in the grip of cruelty, fragments of identity remained, buried deep but unbroken, waiting like embers in the ashes of silence. The silent house of flesh was not simply a den of cruelty, it was a business. Behind every act of suffering lay a system of profit, carefully calculated by the brothel master. Silence was not only enforced for obedience, it was marketed, sold as a luxury. And in this way, human misery was transformed into wealth. The brothel's secrecy attracted the most powerful clients. Officials, generals, and nobles who feared exposure in ordinary brothels came here instead, willing to pay staggering sums for absolute discretion. The silence of the women guaranteed no rumors, no scandals, no blackmail. In a world where reputations could shatter in an instant, silence was worth more than gold. Records from similar institutions suggest how vast the profits may have been. A single night with one of the mute women could cost more than a soldier's monthly wage. The profits of silence enriched the brothel master and protected the clients. But for the women themselves, survival came at a terrible cost. A few lived long enough to leave the silent house, yet freedom did not mean escape. They carried their scars into the world, scars that marked them not only in flesh but in silence that could never be broken. They were survivors without voices. Some were discarded when they grew weak or ill, no longer valuable to the trade. Cast into streets or sold to households as mute slaves, they remained trapped in the role carved for them inside the brothel. Others were released after years of service, but mutilated tongues, broken teeth, or branded skin made them instantly recognizable. Society, far from offering compassion, turned away. A woman marked by silence was rarely welcomed back into her community. In cities where reputation meant survival, these women were doubly condemned, first by the brothel that stole their voices, then by the world that judged them for what they had endured. Many became beggars, surviving on scraps, their silence making them easy to ignore. A few were taken in by temples or charitable households, but even there, they lived as shadows present but unheard. The trauma of their captivity haunted them long after their release. They had learned to suppress every sound, to fear even the movement of lips. Some could not bring themselves to cry openly, even in solitude. Their silence had become instinct, a prison that lingered within them. For these women, survival meant existing without ever fully living again. Historians believe that some survivors tried to communicate their suffering through gestures, carvings, or crude symbols. Yet their testimonies were often dismissed, overshadowed by the shame society attached to prostitution, even when forced. Their stories faded into whispers, easily forgotten. What remained was not their voices, but the silence imposed upon them, silence that history itself almost accepted as truth. And yet, survival carried its own form of defiance. Every woman who lived beyond the brothel was proof that cruelty had not claimed all. Some found strength in caring for one another, forming small circles of solidarity where gestures replaced words. Others passed down warnings, using scars and symbols as silent lessons to younger generations. Even without speech, they carried memory, ensuring that the horrors of the silent house would not vanish completely. The contrast was stark. While the brothel master grew wealthy, while clients returned to families and reputations intact, the women bore the full weight of the silence that had been sold for profit. Their suffering became invisible currency, enriching others while leaving them broken and forgotten. Survivors without voices became not only a description of the women, but a metaphor for countless others erased by systems of exploitation throughout history. Their silence echoes through time, reminding us that the profits of cruelty are fleeting, but the scars they leave endure. The silent house no longer stands, its walls gone to dust. But the memory of those who endured its rituals lingers, women who lived, but who were never heard. Survivors without voices, trapped in a silence that history itself almost chose to keep. Patrons often paid extra for special privileges, the right to witness punishments, to choose among women marked by mutilation, or to stage their own rituals of domination. Cruelty itself became part of the price. The brothel master reinvested these profits into power. Bribes flowed into the hands of city officials, ensuring the silent house remained untouched by law. Guards were well paid to maintain loyalty and silence of their own. Even priests could be bribed to look away, their temples funded by money stained with suffering. Thus, the brothel became untouchable, an institution protected by the very men who should have destroyed it. Profits extended beyond the walls. Some women were leased to traveling elites or lent out for festivals, their silence ensuring discretion wherever they were taken. Others were sold outright to buyers who desired mute slaves in their own households. In this way, the brothel did not only serve its immediate clients, it fueled a trade in human suffering that spread far beyond its doors. But money was not the only currency. Information flowed through the silent house as well. Though the women could not speak, guards and attendants could listen. Drunken soldiers boasted of campaigns, officials muttered of bribes, and nobles whispered of rivalries in the heat of indulgence. The brothel master recorded these secrets, using them as leverage. Silence, once again, was profit not just in gold, but in power over the powerful. Yet while the master grew rich, the women received nothing. Their labor, their pain, their very bodies were consumed for others' gain. They endured hunger while the brothel master dined, wore rags while he cloaked himself in fine robes. The wealth they generated only deepened their captivity, ensuring the guards, the officials, and the entire machinery of cruelty remained loyal to the system. Historians argue that this economy reveals the true horror of the silent house. It was not an isolated act of cruelty, but part of a broader marketplace where human suffering could be turned into profit, where silence became a commodity. The women's pain was not only endured, it was packaged, sold, and protected by the very structures of society. In the end, the silent house stood as proof of how far greed could twist humanity. For its master, silence was gold. For its clients, silence was shield. But for the women trapped inside, silence was a prison without walls, a profit extracted from their every breath. The silent house of flesh eventually vanished, its walls collapsing into dust, its name erased from official records. Yet the silence it created did not die with its ruin. It lingers in history as a shadow and unspoken reminder of how cruelty can be disguised as desire, and how suffering can be turned into profit. The legacy of the silent house is not measured in bricks or wealth, but in the lives it destroyed. Women who entered its doors rarely left whole. Those who survived carried mutilation, trauma, and exile from society. Their silence became permanent, a mark not just on their bodies, but on history itself. They were denied the dignity of testimony. Their stories remain fragments, reconstructed from scattered records and the echoes of rumors. For the men who frequented its chambers, silence was protection. It allowed soldiers to vent their violence, officials to hide their corruption, and elites to indulge their darkest appetites. Their reputations survived untouched, even as the women's lives were erased. This is the most enduring legacy of the silent house, the imbalance of power, where cruelty left scars on the weak, but privilege left no stain on the strong. And yet, in remembering, we defy the silence. To speak of this brothel is to restore voices to those who were denied them. Each scar, each ritual, each act of mutilation becomes evidence, not of pleasure, but of systemic cruelty. By telling their story, we reclaim what the silent house tried to destroy: humanity in the face of dehumanization. The legacy of silence warns us that cruelty thrives when it is hidden, when victims cannot speak, and when society chooses not to listen. The silent house may be gone, but its lesson endures, that unchecked power can turn suffering into spectacle, and that silence, when forced, becomes the most brutal weapon of all.